The GI regime in India has become more like a number game. 658 GI registrations.
Bela Printing was now reduced to just this one last person, Mansukhbhai. Apparently, Mansukhbhai was the only person now left in his family, in his generations, who knew Bela Printing, and this was a classic case of a craft just dying a slow death. Those came out, but when I switched off the recorder, that's when the real thing started coming out. When I went to some Ajrakh weavers, they were showing me their products, and I got very interested, and I got interested in a pastel shade. And they told me, yes, this ye English color hai, which translates to, yes, this is English. And they always used to say that, look, it's not in our culture to sue people. Simification of culture. Culture cannot be stuck in a period of time. It evolves.
Welcome to the Spicy IP podcast. Let's Ipsa lock it up. Today we have with us Miss Niharika Salar. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
She's done extensive fieldwork with the GI artisan communities and has studied extensively about how these GI registrations play out on ground. She's a PhD scholar at Queen's University, Belfast, UK. You can also watch a recent live session that we had on Spicy IP TV, where she was a part of, which was done on higher education in IP. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you.
So, ma'am, let's start with some basic assumptions, right? So, when we look at GI, geographical indication registrations, we always see how GI registrations are being celebrated, right? So we always see the numbers like 658 registrations. We see the government constantly encouraging communities to register and get GI tags for empowerment. For example, recently, the GI amendment rules also suggest a decrease in the fee structure for GI registrations as well as GI filings. So, in this whole context, this assumption that GI registration equals protection for these artisans equals empowerment, is this really true? Can a mere paper of a GI registration tag actually help artisans change their livelihood?
I think it's very important to first understand where this concept comes from, because this whole idea of GI registration equals protection works for some jurisdictions but does not necessarily work for other jurisdictions. Geographical indication, as we are sort of aware of, is essentially this idea that there's a product which is very peculiar to a certain place or a certain region, and therefore there's a certain origin link which is established between these two things, and that link cannot be associated with any other certain region or place. So then you start recognizing the product, and then you start saying that, okay, we are giving you a right in a sense that only people from that certain place can use that certain name on that product. That's what a GI tag or a GI registration certificate essentially means. And what it essentially does is that it allows, or it gives you that monopoly to exercise over a certain product. And it also tells you that nobody else can use that name on that product if it comes from this place. It essentially started from Europe because Europe was very skeptical about increasing wine competition and spirits from Japan and from South American wines. So they got very anxious that we need to create some sort of IP protection where we can control our wines again. And there were other factors as well, like the phylloxera epidemic, where a certain pest was accidentally introduced in Europe, and especially in France, which led to a devastating decline in their wine production. So again, they got really alarmed, and though there were competition laws in place, but they really wanted something more to the point and something more sharper. And that's where GIs got introduced. So GIs were never meant, or that framework was never meant for manufactured or non-agricultural goods. It was the starting idea was always agricultural goods. And that's where concepts of terroir, etc., play an important role because they were the stepping stone, they were the starting point. But now, when these concepts have been transplanted into other jurisdictions where not just agricultural products, but other manufactured or handicraft products are equally important for the economy, for the culture of that certain jurisdiction, how does it play out? And that mismatch is where you see, which is essentially this result of this assumption that, okay, GI registration is protection, which may work in Europe, but does it work in other countries too? And that's where that question mark comes from. When you're talking about other products like handlooms, etc., human intervention becomes a crucial role because it's not just the yarn or the fiber which you get at a certain place, but it's also whether the people know how to weave it and that certain skill and know-how. And that's why India, along with other countries, were really pushing in trips to extend protection from of GIs, not just to agriculture, but to non-agriculture goods. And that's why when we transplanted it into India under TRIPS pressure, we expanded the scope in the Indian GI Act to also include other products. So this was an attempt to ensure that it works for other industries, other important industries in India, but does it or does it not is again something which we are seeing over a period of time. The default assumption is flawed in the sense that it doesn't work in India because in different states they have their different visuals and visions of what a GI tag should mean. So, for instance, Assam is very proactive in GI registrations, and when I was interviewing somebody, they said with a very critical dimension that every time a GI tag is registered, there's a huge fanfare. There are GI camps, there are government camps set up, awareness camps set up to celebrate that tag registration. But the weavers actually don't know what they are getting into. They are being told a story that from now onwards, nobody else can use the name on your product, only you can. But they don't have that kind of confidence because they see similar competition from fast fashion brands, from power looms, from other brands which use the same visual aesthetics on the product, but still get away. So in terms of empowerment, I mean, we can discuss this ahead too. There are various ways in which one can be empowered, economic, soft power, etc., etc. But not all of it is reaching to the weavers who are at the ground level. And I mean, I'll wait for you to maybe take this discussion in another direction, and I can talk more about it then.
Yeah, so even when you mentioned about the awareness, so like we see awareness campaigns happening, but does this awareness actually reach out to the artisans who are actually there in the manufacturing process?
It's very interesting because a lot, I mean, sure, there are a lot of attempts to make sure that not just producers but also consumers like you and me are aware of what a GI tag is. Now, obviously, this is a different context because we are sitting in an IP session and all of that. So this is what we talk about. But what about people who are not from a law background? They still don't know what a GI tag is, despite all the fanfare. And a major reason is simply lack of interest and lack of media exposure. So, for instance, the Prada Kolhapuri chappal recent controversy, where Prada, this big high-end luxury brand, came up with their collection where they featured brown leather sandals. That's what they called it. And any other Indian sort of realized that, oh, this is very similar to what maybe we wear at home under our kurtis or whatever, Kolhapuri chappal. So, what happened then was that there was a lot of backlash on media, as you may know. And what interested me was that this has been happening for ages. There's another spicy IP post which I did on the kaftan, and this was I think some I don't know 4 or 5 years ago maybe, and it was very interesting because then there was not this kind of backlash. It's the exercise, the infringement activity, if I may use that word, was the same, but what has changed is that people know a bit more about it. They know what the term is. They know there is something called a GI tag. So that level of awareness has definitely increased in the last few months, and that's the only reason why there was so much backlash on Prada. And it has resulted into something in a sense that Prada still goes on to produce these chappals, but now they say that no, it's made in India. They're trying to whitewash their profile by saying, no, we visited India, we went to Maharashtra, we went to Kolhapur, had a word with the artisans, learned from them, etc., etc. That was only possible because of that backlash. And why did that backlash come? Because people know a little bit more about, okay, maybe there's something called a GI tag. But where the awareness is lacking is that we still don't know what exactly a GI tag means. And secondly, when it comes to weavers, it drops down to literacy rate. And it drops down to very, very simple issues like accessibility. For example, when I was in Gujarat, somebody told me, and in Gujarat, I was seeing a lot of successful stories and many reasons behind it. But somebody told me that you should actually go and visit Rajasthan and see the story there. And I said, okay, why? And she told me, and this she's the head of an NGO which works with cluster artisans, and she told me that look, in places like Bikaner and Kota, where it gets extremely hot and warm, no research teams wants to visit this place, and because of lack of funds, because of lack of access, lack of interest, two neighboring states see a very different picture of GI. While Gujarat sees a lot of success stories, Rajasthan, on the other hand, which arguably has more cultural artifacts than Gujarat in terms of numbers, they're not able to see similar success because of these reasons. So it drops down to as simple reasons as these that, despite awareness scams, people are just not interested enough to know more about it.
Yeah, and
So,
that shows the difference in dynamics between states itself, like Gujarat
right.
and Rajasthan itself, uh, being so different in terms of how GI is approached. So this also brings me to this concept where factors like institutional support. For example, the National Bank for Agriculture and Rural Development, NABARD, provides a lot of support to artisans to actually register their GI products and GI tags. So I think by 2025, I think almost 138 GI tags have been registered just with support and help from institutions like NABARD. So I'm also wondering about, like how you mentioned, there have been differences from state to state. What differences and variations in the approach to GI would be there with factors like institutional support from institutions like NABARD?
Institutional support and backing is essential, not just from economic and funds point of view, but also just simply knowledge point of view, to be very fair. So, for example, Darjeeling tea, Pashmina, they're all success stories. And in every GI class, this is what you will study is because they're the popular products. But what is more important is that they have been able to place themselves at a peculiar position for the Indian economy that they bring a lot of export value. So when you have a lot of export value, when you have institutional backing, big organizations like Tea Board India and Pashmina being supported by Craft Development Institute in Srinagar, they don't just have the capacity to fund GI applications and the fees, but they also have the capacity to market it in a way that not just Indians but the overseas diaspora and overseas also becomes popular. And I do want to say this that I didn't realize it then, but once I started seeing Darjeeling tea being exported and when I saw it outside too being celebrated as this Indian tea, I did appreciate the enormous success of what it is like simply because Tea Board of India was supporting it to an extent, and it was also one of the first GI tags registered. So definitely institutional backing is very key. It also helps in who gets to be registered as an authorized user. There's enough awareness and there's enough pushing of producers to come and get themselves registered. Now, why they don't want to register themselves as an authorized user is a different story altogether, which we can talk about later. But yes, institutional backing in that sense makes a big difference because it all comes down to export value. For some reason, non-agricultural products, handicraft products have not seen that kind of success. And one reason is simply because they don't bring that kind of economics and money in the Indian economy as agricultural products do. Yeah.
So, before we move on, let's just take a step back and look at the number of stakeholders who are involved in this whole process. So, there's these actual artisans and producers who actually produce the goods, and then there are a number of intermediaries who come in between. There are traders, there are exporters, and then there are authorized users as well. So, just correct me if I'm wrong. So, authorized users are the ones who are legally entitled to use the GI tag, right?
Yes.
And even say a GI product gets the GI tag and GI registration is provided, until those individual artisans who are actually involved in making that product register themselves as an authorized user, they are not going to benefit out of this whole registration process, right? So, again, keeping in mind the different stakeholders involved and the GI, the authorized users in this process, let's look at what this actually means to the real artisans. Are the real artisans actually able to make an income out of it? Or is the livelihood really changing? How does that play out? And even with respect to the product premium that we talk about, are they able to get a product premium, and are their products able to get into the zone of a product premium in the domestic market uh, with just these registrations?
Again, I think the answer will differ for agricultural products and for non-agricultural products. For agricultural products, for example, rasgulla, or for example, there's a certain sort of chili which we get in Telangana, with the name of which I can't recall, but somebody did told me that after a successful GI tag registration, they were able to price their product in a way that it became slightly more expensive. Is it premium price? Maybe no, but still definitely an increase in prices. But when I went to handloom products, and I want to talk about Ajrakh here. Ajrakh is a textile which the Khatri community extensively practices. And with Ajrakh, when I asked them, then they had recently got a GI tag. I asked them that were you able to, were you able to see any difference in your lives in terms of just financial aid? They said not really. What they were happy about was that more people were knowing about Ajrak and more people were associating Kutch with Ajrak, the Kutch region in Gujarat. They did not say anything about funds. And as far as authorized users are concerned, when I asked them, "Are you a registered authorized user?" Uh, most of them said no. But what was interesting was that I could see their names on the GI registry website on the paperwork that they were or they were not registered. So there was a definitely clear mismatch between who was telling them what and who were using their names to upload on the GI portal as far as documentation is concerned, so that you get a GI tag certificate. One reason why people do not get excited with authorized users, and Muga silk in Assam is a great example for this. When Muga silk got their GI tag registration, for the first 3 years, their authorized users were a single digit number. And then the GI registry in Chennai sent them official communication that if you don't want to have authorized users, we will discontinue this GI program. So there was this constant communication between government of Assam and GI registry. And one reason why people are not excited about it is that in the GI specification, you are required to give a detailed process of how that product is made. And Ajrak, for instance, has 11 different stages of dyeing the cloth, of weaving the cloth, etc.
Mhm.
Now, with market pressures, there is a lot of pressure on weavers to make the product look similar, but produce it faster and produce it in larger numbers. And that's very difficult to do if you stick to the original way of making ajrak, the 11 steps. So if you are an authorized user, you are obligated to stick to those 11 steps of making it, because you're obligated by the GI specification details. But if you're not an authorized user, you can still make something similar looking, but you don't have, you can make it faster. So for example, screen printing. In Ajrakh and in different handloom textiles, hand block printing is the original way of making it, which is a very extensive, labor extensive work of chapai, what you call in Hindi.
Mhm.
Uh, but well, people don't have that kind of time right now because they see multiple orders and they want to cater to bigger markets. So now in the last few years, they have started screen printing, where you have a block already and you don't, and it's not as labor intensive as
It's
hand
an
block.
easier process.
Yes. But the interesting part, and this we can discuss in theoretical aspects, is that the GI specification does not mark a difference between hand printing and between screen printing. So where you don't have that kind of distinction, people don't mind being an authorized user because they can get away with faster production ways, but still create the same product. But when you have to stick to a certain specification, and that matters more in agricultural products, you are obligated to stick to it, and people don't do that because then their revenue sufficiently decreases.
I was also reading about this Pochampally Ikat, where in the process of manufacturing it, I think each family who manufactures it takes about 4 5 days of
Yeah.
time to actually get into the process and manufacture that, which is again, like you said, very labor intensive. But um, when there are also things like power looms coming in and the ability, or when they are able to do it in a much faster way, what happens to the to even the quality of what comes out
Mhm.
by the products which are done by the artisans who do it in the traditional way. So again, that whole conflict of doing it in the traditional way versus trying to commercialize it to be able to uh, look at the funds aspect of it or make a livelihood aspect of it, right?
And quality is directly proportionate to that origin link which we were talking about, and that is what GIs cater to. But
Hmm.
when you have these slight differences in the law itself, which does not differentiate between, say, an organic way of making a product and an inorganic way of making a product, then there is not enough incentive even for weavers to stick to it, because maybe the law is trying to protect the cultural heritage, if you may say so, but they are not taking into account how the markets have changed significantly from when the law was made and what the law is now. And that's where you see that clear disconnect.
So can we say that on one hand, GI is considered a way to preserve cultures and crafts which have been existing for a long time? For example, this was even pointed out in a book by Nidhi Butch and Hetvi Trivedi, where they mention about how some of the almost going to be extinct products, like with respect to even Kota Juria for that matter, or other products which are almost going to be extinct, GI was seen as a way to revive them and protect those cultures. But on the other hand, we also see how, you know, like how we were just discussing about how livelihood pressures come in, funding pressures come in, that most of the weavers, most of these artisans are forced to move out of the practice that they have been doing for a long time because they have not been having consistent incomes, because they are not aware of what the law is or how they could better be protected. Which is also not just this, but even when you look at the future generations, looking at how the condition is now, I don't think a lot of people from the future generations would have the incentive to continue this traditional practice or continue this practice, which again leads to degradation of these traditional cultures. So it's like two sides to it. So, do you think this whole market problem and this whole issues of how the economy functions is actually a GI problem per se, which GI law can address, or does this entirely lie out of GI and is there some other route to cater to these issues?
So, like I said, GIs were for wines. So, as long as you are a country for whose cultural significance lies in their wines, you are sorted. But for different countries, like I said, handlooms and other industries become far more significant. And whether, to answer your question, whether it can actually be a successful tool in reviving culture is a bit of a hit and a miss. And I'll give you an example. While visiting artisans, I came across somebody called Mansukhbhai, and somebody told me that there is an artwork which Khatri artisans used to practice ages ago called the Bela Printing. And the situation was such that Bela Printing was now reduced to just this one last person, Mansukh Bhai. Apparently, Mansukh Bhai was the only person now left in his family, in his generations, who knew Bela Printing, and this was a classic case of a craft just dying a slow death, if not a fast death, actually, unfortunately. So when I interviewed him, I asked him, "What are your plans? I mean, do you want to revive this? How do you feel?" Now, obviously, as an interviewer, I didn't want to feed answers to him, so it was more of a chief examination and not cross examination. So he told me that it was only because of this organization called Khamir. Khamir is an NGO doing great work. That Khamir called him, Khamir housed him, and Khamir gave him the space to continue Bela Printing because due to financial needs, that craft was almost dead. So then I asked him that, have you taught this to your kids? He said that what's the point, because we don't get any money out of it. It was only because of Khamir that I'm here. And it's only because of my interest that okay, there is some lineage attached to this craft and everything. But my kids are not bothered. My one kid is a lawyer, and the second kid I have forced him into Bela Printing because Khamir forced me. And that's where, like you were saying, the role of intermediaries, NGOs and cooperative societies, and even design institutes. So NID Ahmedabad also had a big role to play in this because research teams from that university went to Ajrakhpur, to Dhamadka. These are villages where Ajrak were being practiced. To collect documentation. And documentation is exactly what they need for a GI tag certificate, which they don't have primarily. So then I asked him that, okay, Mansukh Bhai, about Bela Printing, that what are you going to do about a GI tag? So then Mansukh Bhai told me that GI tag requires an association. GI tag is essentially a collective right. Will it protect a single person who knows a craft is a different question altogether, because unlike other IP legal regimes, GIs are not meant for individual, creation or individual ownership. So that I thought was an interesting dilemma, because on the one hand we are saying that the craft is dying and we should protect it, but on the other hand, GIs are not meant for a single protector, single person, as in. So then my next question was, what are you going to do? So he said Khamir will do a bit of hand holding. And I would like to reiterate, he said, "Dekho, bol to rahe hain kuch kuch, but I don't know if I will," he says, "I don't know if I will live enough to even see if it gets a GI tag or not, because we will need to form an association of people who are interested enough in Bela Printing." But he's just the sole person who's
And
interested.
there's
So
nobody else interested
yeah,
there.
there's nobody else
It's
interested because they
Mansukhbhai.
don't know, they're not interested in the lineage. They also feel that GI framework is not meant for a single person. So I don't know. It's a very there has to be follow-up research on this. I'll have to go back and see after a few years what happens to Veda printing. So yeah, in terms of reviving culture, it's a bit of a hit and a miss. It's not really as popular in terms of reviving culture as they say. Even with Ajrak, and I know I'll just take 2 minutes for this. Um, with Ajrak, what was interesting was that it was a very self hand holding exercise which Khatris did within themselves. So there was a big earthquake in Bhuj in 2001, where Ajrak artisans were initially residing in a village called Dhamadka, and that entire village was destroyed. And one thing which was important for their craft was the water quality. because in crafts where dyeing is a big part of the process, you need a lot of good quality water with less iron oxide percentage in it.
Mm.
But after the earthquake, the water body near Dhamadka, obviously the village itself was destroyed, but the water content also saw a sharp increase in iron content. So that village was no more fit for Ajrak. So then there were a few senior village artisans who took it upon themselves to revive it, and then they found a place near Bhuj. They resettled there. They called it Ajrakpur because they went with the intention that we will continue doing this craft, but in a different place now. There was no GI tag here. There was no support then. The only support the government gave them was help them in rehabilitation and give them land near Bhuj where they could come and live, and they could test the water content for their craft. GI tag came much later. So sometimes I also feel that a lot of credit is given to GIs for reviving culture, but that's not really the case.
True.
GIs actually come much later. It's like that little meme where the dog is holding its own collar and walking. Yeah, I don't know if I'm making sense, but that's what I feel.
Yeah, that's so true, especially in the context of the examples that you've been giving on what really GI is meant to do. We
Yeah.
also spoke a bit about quality. In fact, when we look at GI or like a meaningful GI regime, isn't quality the most important aspect of it? And in that context, uh, with a reduction in quality, like again, like how we've spoken about before this as well, uh, a reduction in quality is not just making that GI tag a mere paper, which it already is, but it also has a major impact on these artisans who are actually involved in the process, right? So I was reading this book by Yogesh Pai and Tanya Singla, where they mention that in many ways it could be said that Indian GI regime promotes a system of vanity GI, where registration of GI is seen as an end in itself, with very little attention to the deep linkages between the registration of GI and the quality control that should follow post GI registration. And I think the statement holds very true in the context of all the examples that we've been discussing as well, of GI being like GI not really being of the use it is supposed to be, but the attention that the lesser attention that's being paid to the link between quality and GI. And this also brings me to another problem that they point out in this book of free riders within the GI community, where the people within the community itself, the producers, are ready to compromise on that little bit of quality for that extra margin of income. Because, like we saw, there is livelihood pressure. Like, even examples like Mansukhbhai, where he's the only one, he's not interested in pursuing it further because of the livelihood impact that it has on him. But when you also look at people where in groups where there are multiple artisans and multiple producers, one of them being okay with reducing the quality for that little bit of margin versus the impact that has on others, right? So in that whole context, how do you think this plays out in India? Especially in India, I think I would like to take the example of the Banarasi saris, where there is decline in quality, but the inspection board has not been able to stop these weavers from declining the quality. And I'm not sure what the actual reason is it the problem of these inspection bodies, and is it a procedural lapse, or is it something which GI law itself can police over?
Interestingly, and I'll just quickly talk about the origin link problem first, and then come to free riders, as you mentioned. Uh, because it's it's a law which was a result of European anxiety over wines. Origin Link in Europe, they have very nicely been able to differentiate different labels. So there is the PGI label, which is the protected geographical indication. There's the PDO label, which is the protected designation of origin. And then there's something called the TSG, Traditional Specialty Guaranteed Label. They're all parts of the sui generis GI system. But what the differentiating factor between these is the declining origin link. So PGI would be somewhere in the middle. PDO would be that the product has to come from this certain place. PGI would be that the product can come from this certain place, but the ingredients can be exported from other places. And TSG is the bare minimum that this is a certain recipe. So, for example, pizza napolitana is a great example of it. It can be made anywhere. It can be it can be prepared in any restaurant, but as long as the recipe is the same which the Italians used to follow at one point of time. So there are varying factors even in GI law in Europe, which they have been able to capture so that they can contain that space where the name of that place still comes up in different intensities. But in India, when that law was transplanted, so far, we have not been able to bifurcate that, look, there's a certain product, there's a certain handloom, certain textile which comes from this place, but maybe the skill is a bit different, but you will still use the same name, Ajrakh, for example. So in India, we have not been able to bifurcate that, and that is why there is so much confusion around whether we are protecting quality or we are protecting how the product looks, what the visual aesthetics is like, or whether we are just protecting the skills and the know-how. And the human factor comes actually much later because again, that was never part of GI or Terroir to begin with. And that is why free riders become a problem because the law is meant to target the product and not the person. People and viewers are not given enough incentives to stick to what the actual product should be made like. So, for instance, when I went to some Ajrak weavers, they were showing me their products, and I got very interested, and I got interested in a pastel shade, and they told me, yes, this ye English color hai, which translates to, yes, this is English color. And I said, sir, what do you mean by that? He said that ये आजकल बहुत बिकता है, ये पेस्टल शेड्स है आजकल, आप जैसे नौजवान लड़कियों को यही पसंद आता है, ये तो कभी बनता भी नहीं था. अजरक तो हमेशा हरा, नीला और काले में होता था. Which I will translate now is that he said that the color Ajrak was always meant to be made from black, indigo and blue, indigo and red and green, because these were the natural dyes which came from turmeric, from the combination of indigo, etc. But now, because younger girls and people like you are inspired by what you see in pop culture, you want pastel shades, etc., we have to make these shades. And there is no original organic way of making, say, a pastel pink. You have to put in synthetic dyes, which means that they are departing from the original way of making ajrak. So the visual aesthetics of it, the motifs, the designs remain the same, but the colors are changing to suit the changing needs of the audience, of the consumers like you and me. And that's where then free riders come in because it's easier for them. They don't have to stick to the original specification. One person even he gave me this little hint that come here, I'll show you something. And I said, show. And then he said, look, I made these interesting color combinations from this. And I said, but how? Because this is not how originally Ajrak is made. And then he said, no, I'm experimenting with these colors. And we have to do it because we cater to a different market now. People don't want to wear the same things. It's as simple as even say I'm wearing chicken curry from Lucknow. Kurtis came in much later, or say different silhouettes like short kurtis came in much later. Well, it was originally meant for Maharajas shawls and saris, right? The Nawabs, not Maharajas. So it's changing. The visual aesthetics is changing. The silhouette is changing. And that is why the making of the craft is also changing. ILGI specification allows subtle changes whenever you want to renew your GI specification. But it cannot be a change which completely departs from what the product actually looks like. And that again is open to interpretation. What exactly is a change substantial enough to depart from the original product? And how much of it is by need and how much of it is by desire? is again a big question mark because the GI law is sort of absent on it. And that's why these problems like free riders, etc., come in. It's we look at it negatively, sure, but there's also a positive lens to it. Like, what will the artisan do if not change their ways? They have to compete in a market like that. So, yeah,
This
different ways of looking at it. It may not necessarily be a problem. It may be a problem in the law, not the artisan's problem.
Now this makes me also think about some new approaches where this may not really be bad in terms of like how, say, these artisans, like you mentioned, uh, also depend on how the consumer is perceiving it, or how the changing society, changing needs of the society, and how the new culture is coming up. They also want to cater to that. And I think uh, it's not a very pushed back approach, because this also helps in evolution of that craft, right?
Exactly.
So we are not just limiting to what was it in the past. Yes, the older traditions and how it began and how it was is very important, but that cannot stop us from evolving further. What if what they are creating could come out as something very new and something uh, very different, which changes the whole perception of how the consumer would perceive something in the past, or something during those times, right? So evolution, I think, is another very important aspect of it. And um, I think we should also look at the positive side and not just look at how look at the negative impacts of um, GI, but also look at some positives which exist around the community.
You're right. In terms of protection, and there is a very interesting line of argument that GIs are actually a culprit of what people say museumification of culture. Culture cannot be stuck in a period of time. It evolves. And this is a very American way of arguing. Christopher Springman, etc. They all say the same thing, that culture has to evolve. And you cannot say put a full stop or a stamp on it that it's say stuck in a way that it was made in say 1800s or 1940s, whatever. uh, people will people will have to evolve the craft. There can only be two ways: either they keep up to the market pressures and they keep experimenting and evolving their craft, or they leave the industry altogether. And we see both things happening. Most people who cannot who cannot keep up with experimenting and keeping up the craft to changing needs of the audience usually leave, and they are not able to do so because they don't have the luxury of spending enough funds on experimenting. So they what happens is that they leave. So then in this equation, GIs are not really helping, because GIs are coming and telling you that look, you used to make this craft, or you're not you, your your earlier generations used to make this craft in a certain way and you have to stick to it. But the new generation doesn't feel like that. For example, there's a certain lady called Mubassirah Khatri, and in Ajrakh, what was very interesting to me was that I was the alone female going on my scooty on villages and speaking to people, and all males. Like, it was a very interesting experience from a sociological angle. And then somebody told me that, look, there's a girl. She doesn't. Her work was recently showcased in Lakme Fashion Week in Mumbai, and you might want to go and speak to her. So I got very excited and I asked her, "What do you think of GI law?" And her response was, "I don't care with GI. I don't care about GI law because, um, because, because not everyone is included in decision-making processes. Not everyone has access to those institutions. It's usually the, and if I may, older male privileged people of that village. Not what if I had to put a very normal term to it, maybe the sarpanch, but they don't do that in Gujarat. So I'm conscious of not using that term there. So then I asked, okay, then what do you do? So she said, but I am involved in the craft because my parents used to do this. My parents taught me this. But I want to make it on kaftans now because this is what sells. And she had very interesting designs of sticking to the traditional Ajrak, but also experimenting with motifs. And I said, look, this is also important, but probably GI law doesn't have a place for her. So it's free riding. Yes, it's a problem, but it's also a necessity. Basole says this. It's a ship of thesis problem, basically. How do you say that invention and reinvention while also sticking to the original way? Because GI law doesn't have the bandwidth to account both. It will only stick to one, and not everyone has the privilege of sticking to the older ways of making it.
And creativity comes with evolution.
Of
So
course.
the more you create, the more the new things coming up. And yeah, like so protection again comes back to with GI not being able to accommodate for the newer generations, the newer ideas and the newer ways of wanting to express um, the craft. Now that we've also discussed a bit about gender and politics, um, how does identity politics and caste also play out here? And do you with your research, have you come across dynamics that actually impact and play a role in uh, the whole GI regime in itself?
While going in the field, my the question driving my questionnaire and interview protocol was not stemming from either questions of identity politics. It was more about like my defining question was that how collective is GI law, and then when I started speaking more about it, no, none of these people told me these things directly. It was something which I started observing. For instance, when I went to 7, 8 houses, why did everyone say that no, go to that house because he knows more, or because he's the one who was hand leading it? And then when I started speaking more to people off the record, that's when I started realizing that okay, class is definitely a big role, in a sense that who gets to dictate that you will be a part of the association, or this is how we will do the craft, or this is how we will interact with the department who's coming to visit us, or I am responsible for historical documents, or I will participate with NID and not others. Who gets to dictate that? So class was definitely something which I was seeing. There is enough scope. There's a lot of scope for research for other criterias which dictate, for example, caste. Now, since I went to a place where I'm not from, Gujarat, I was conscious of that as a limitation of the researcher, and I was conscious of not asking them questions around caste, at least on record, because that always comes with the risk of making them feel that I'm not one of them, and then obviously that big wall which I, as a researcher, has a responsibility to shatter, it becomes even more difficult between me and the interviewee. So no, I did not discuss those ideas. One reason was also because I wanted to contain my project. And if I went into identity politics too much, there was always a risk of going way too much into the social legal side of things. While my project still is very much social legal, but I was conscious of not drifting away into that direction too much. So there's a lot of scope for research, yes. But as far as my current project is concerned, I was conscious of not foraying into that direction.
Now that we've looked at all the practical challenges involved, not just challenges, I would also say a lot of interesting stories that you brought out with actually going and talking to people and understanding cultures in such a better way. Let's take a step back and look at what texts say. Let's look at concepts. One thing that you've mentioned about before and you've been constantly bringing about is the concept of GI starting off from Europe and the whole concept of terroir, right? So you have a product, you have a place, and the product is linked to that place, and that makes the concept of terroir and how climatic conditions and natural environments actually play a role there, right? Um, when every time you mention that, it reminds me of Dev Ganji's work, where he brings about the importance of not just limiting to terroir as a concept, but also having human elements involved. Because terroir as a concept seems to be very neutral with respect to communities. But when we look at the context in India, we have a lot of things involved. We have caste, we have um, class dynamics, we have gender. There are so many examples of gender that you gave. We see the differences in the kota durya community and many other dynamics which exist. Now, how does this whole idea of human intervention play out in the Indian concept considering these elements?
The idea of terroir is again a very, very French concept. And some academic literature points out to the idea that it was essentially a result of, or it was a means for French culinary nationalism during a time where France was going through a political revolution in the 1800s. And it's a term which does not actually apparently has a direct equivalent translation in English. And the idea is that French winemakers felt that they have a direct emotional relationship to the soil, and that's where this concept comes from. But now increasingly you see multiple interpretations, and that's where Delphine, Ganji, all these people, they all come in and say that we need to recognize that human factors are also part and parcel of that certain region, because the region is not just made of soil or weather conditions, but it's also made of the people who reside in there. The problem with that is that people are not stuck in one region, they migrate. So when a certain community migrates from place X to place Y, sure, they take the skills with them, but the soil changes, the weather conditions changes, the air, humidity, etc., all of that changes. And again, it's important, and that's why I'm constantly saying this. It was important for wines, it was important for agricultural products, but it's not so important for non-agricultural products and especially handicrafts. And I'll give you an example of this. Bandhani in India has 3 different GI tag registrations. And it was very interesting because when I looked up at the GI registry online, these are all online documents. When you look for Bandhani, you will have some five, 6 different registrations and 3 registrations with the same name Bandhani, one with Kutch, one with Jamnagar, and one with Jodhpur. And when I asked Khatri artisans in Bhuj and in Ajrakh, Bandhani artisans are mainly in Bhuj. I asked them, what's the difference between these 3 Bandhanis and why are there 3 different GI tags? And then they got very, defensive, and they told me कि नहीं नहीं वो हमारे ही लोग हैं, हमारी ही लड़कियां वहां ब्याह के गई थी, which translates to that we are all part of the same Khatris. So Khatris are Hindus as well as Muslims. And the ones which went to Jamnagar were the Hindu Khatris. And some of them were also their daughters and their, the girls in the Khatri family in Bhuj, in Kutch region. They went and they went to Jamnagar, and they took those skills with them, and that's how the craft expanded to that side of Gujarat, the mainland of Gujarat. And it's very interesting because Bandhani is an artwork which the females do. So it was very interesting because in family dynamics, it was very clear. The roles were very divided. The women would sit in their rooms and do bandhani. So bandhani is essentially tie-dye, where you tie the cloth into small pieces and then you dye them and then you open the fabric, and that's where those vivacious colors and designs come up. And the men, on the other hand, would be block printing, Ajrakh, in the warehouse outside the house. So these roles were divided. So when these girls married into other families, they started traveling to further distances. Their in-laws were at different places. And in our culture, it's usually that the girl marries and goes to the other house and stays there. That's how these skills translated. And that's how it went to different places. So then I said, okay, then what's the difference between, say, how the bandhani looks in these different places? So then they said that the way is still the same. The method is still the same. You still sit and extensively keep tying it. It's called bandhana, and that's where the name bandhani comes from. But the motives are a bit different, and that's where I mentioned religion, because Hindu Khatris would do a lot of animal motives, elephant, etc. But apparently, Muslim in Islam, they don't do that. They stick to other motives, and the motives are a bit different. The designs are different, but the way of making it is still the same. And in Jodhpur, apparently in Rajasthan, they do it on different fabric. So they do it more on Georgia. They don't do it on silk and all of those differences. But when I looked at the GI specifications and when I opened on the GI registry website, there was a lot of confusion because the GI specification in Jamnagar Bandhani was saying that because the river flows through Jamnagar, the artisans in Jamnagar have been doing this skill from ages ago. But Kutch Bandhani GI specification credited the Kutch region for it. And what my first impression was that it seems that nobody in the GI registry went and actually checked or did enough research for these claims. Like whatever documentation they got, they accepted it and they registered it. And in my head, I thought that this was also probably a solution to migration. This was probably the registry's way of acknowledging that we know that there are different communities doing the same thing, but we can't credit just one place for it, so we will give it to different places. I don't know if that's a solution, but that was my first impression to it. I don't know if that was the intention. But then that defeats the whole purpose because now Bandhani apparently comes from three different places. So it's no more essentially the origin link between a place and a product. It's recognizing human intervention. It's recognizing that people migrate. Um, is this, I don't know if this would be a good way of going about it, but apparently in terms of registration, this is what I would like to say a temporary solution, maybe which has been reached, but it would show in enforcement. Because if somebody copies Bandhani, do all three of them have the right to go and sue? Maybe not. And anyway, they don't want to sue, but I don't, maybe if we will talk about suing because, okay, I'll just take a minute to mention this. When I kept asking them so I had my questionnaire and one question, one theme was that I keep asking them, then what do they think of litigation as an enforcement strategy? And they always used to say that, look, it's not in our culture to sue people. This is again a very Western idea that if somebody is copying from me, I will go and ask for credit, and if I don't get credit, I will sue. This is not how we at least used to like Oriental values are not necessarily this. It's more about sharing, and that's the reason why you have so many translations and themes of Ramayana and Mahabharata. And even in even in say if somebody is making a certain copy, the first resolution would be to go and talk and not necessarily sue. So like all the answer was almost negative. Nobody was excited about using a GI tag as a way to go to a court of law to sue. The idea would always be to first enforce, and it's so interesting because they would tell me that कि हमें इन्हीं के साथ रहना है, ये हमारे ही भाई हैं, हमें लड़ाई झगड़ा नहीं करना है इनके साथ, which translates to that these are our people. This we share this craft together, and no, I just because of a GI tag, I don't get the right to go and sue them because our generations are all linked to the same place from where the craft came from. So this entire idea of litigation is not how our, if I use the term, if I may use the term values. It's again a transplanted concept. It's again we're being told that no sue. So again, for instance, the main person in, and I will not take their name because I have still not got his consent form yet. Um, he told me about an instance where a designer in Mumbai was using Ajrakh on a skull, and that they took offense to it because for them Ajrak is a craft which is all about nature and happiness and livelihood, and they associate a skull with death, and there's a negative connotation to it, and they got offended by it. So their first response was to call them up and tell them that this is nothing doing this, you can't really do this, and the designer obliged. I don't know. I mean, if I think at the first resolution is always to sort it out
amongst themselves.
because
Maybe like an ADR kind of an approach.
yeah, they not even ADR, see, because they don't want to go through these systems. They're like
Procedure.
कि दुकान भी तो चलानी है हमें, कोर्ट के चक्कर कौन काटेगा? We have to run the shop also, who will go to the court? So my point is that nobody, and I was interviewing two people, so professionals and law firm partners were also very skeptical about it because the clients they would get were not excited about it in terms of enforcing it. They only wanted recognition because for somehow their idea of a GI tag is recognition. That's all. That as long as I get a recognition, I'm fine with it. They're still very skeptical. They still show more confidence in trademark law as a regime. They are more excited about a silk mark as a collective mark, as a certification mark. That's where their confidence lies more in. GI tags is because somebody came and told them. And a law firm partner did use this term. GI tags are shoved and forced upon communities because of the regime. They say, there's a goal. We need to have a certain number of GI tags registered by 2030. So that comes at the cost of apparently forcing communities to get it registered without doing due diligence on whether it actually deserves it. Is there something similar? What the GI certification says?
That's such an interesting way of approaching communities and approaching how to deal with GI law per se, which makes us even question on whether do we really need GI in the first place, considering all that communities want is recognition. So
Mm.
how would that play out? Another very recent step by the government. So there's this proposed draft guideline by the DPIIT, which has come out with a draft guideline for GI and GI logo,
Mhm.
where they mention that these authorized users, so the eligibility criteria for getting a GI tag, right, is not just authorized users, but also the other players that we were talking about, like the intermediaries or the exporters or the traders who get that consent from the authorized user, also can own that GI tag and also can be an eligible user in this process. So, this means that an exporter who has not really contributed effort and work into doing a particular craft can get a GI tag. At the same time, the person who's actually contributed and actually done the work, who deserves that recognition, who deserves that protection, can also get, but it's we don't know whether they would get or not. But basically, there's an extra category of people who are also eligible to get. The question of placing the intermediaries and the actual artisans and the actual practitioners on the same level, where we already know the impact of the powerful nature of these intermediaries and the dilution that it would create more on the actual practitioners and the actual artisans who actually put in the effort of the particular craft and who've been getting it from generations after generations. This kind of the what is the implication of placing them at the same level, right? So what is the why? What do you think is the impact of such a move by DPIIT on artisans because of these extra category of people also who are eligible for protection now, who've actually not really been a part of the process?
I think the guidelines are a result of a push from a lot of legal entities and law firms saying that you need to, create an ecosystem where you do more hand holding to artisans, and also that you cannot work in as a standalone entity. You have to work with the Department of Textiles, Ministry, and all of these other bodies who understands the concerns and interests of weavers way more than DPIIT does, for instance. So my understanding is that this is a result of that. What will be the implications? I'll be very honest, it's a bit too early to say whether it will work or not. Because in all honesty, even with the GI tags, it's still too early to say, because not many GI tags have completed even their first tenure of 10 years to establish whether it's a success or not. And that's the reason why there is a lack of research on just the simple question whether GI tags help in premium pricing the product. In my understanding, there is not enough research on this because of these reasons, that they have not been able to still complete their first cycle of protected tenure. As far as including more entities is concerned, I believe, in my opinion, and I want to tie it back to my previous thought, the more export value a product has, the more incentive different entities will have to maybe protect it in a way that you give it a monopoly and you give it sort of a negative right that nobody else can use it. If you don't have that kind of export value, then there is probably less motivation, because let's be honest, protecting culture, etc., looks good on paper, but it's not really how it works out in the field. Those sentiments are not really there. When you will speak to an old person, when you will speak to an 18-year-old person, the differences are stark, very stark, very different. So it looks good in journal articles and books, but doesn't play out necessarily there. So including exporters, I feel, is an attempt to bring more economic value to the product, and to create more motivation for different entities to come in and invest their funds, their energy into a certain product. But having said that, and like you also pointed out, we are well aware that the hierarchy dynamics do play out. Forget about exporters, even within the community, those dynamics are very real. And that's one argument which I'm trying to make in my thesis, that GIs actually reinforce those community hierarchies within the dynamics. And I know I'm deviating a bit, but I think I do want to mention this one example. I was at a government body in Bhuj and I wanted to interview him. But naturally, a problem with interviews is that they don't really consent to it. And even when he did, when I switched on the recorder, all the politically correct answers came out. But when I switched off the recorder, that's when the real thing started coming out. So I requested him that, can I just observe in your office? Can I just sit? And he obliged. So I sat in his office for a good few hours, and there were a lot of people coming in and meeting him, sharing their concerns. And what I noticed was that there was this community of people from a place called Mundra in Gujarat who are Batik printers. They're also Khatris. And apparently, this government official was trying to make a collective association out of them from the past 6 years. But because of their community dynamics, in a sense that there is one leader, there are some people who will follow him, there are some people who don't agree with his views, they were not able to form a collective association, which is the first requirement of applying for a GI tag. So, even within my point, what I'm trying to say is that there are different intermediaries who come in with good intention and who want to help the community by collecting them in one association, because that's the starting process. But they're unable to do so because the community dynamics don't allow it. So probably having exporters also, or sort of expanding the range of people who might be interested, is an attempt to do that. But whether it will play out or not is a different question or not. And again, the story will be different from product to product and from state to state too. So it's more of a wait and a watch thing, but I am not necessarily excited about it, because I think there's a lot of issues in the initial text itself and in the enforcement itself which needs to be worked on, rather than including more changes without working on what the problems are already there.
That's such interesting stories and points that you brought out. So again, it was important for us to look at the law because uh like placing registration and enforcement at an equal footing by the law through policy is an important step. But is the law actually doing that? Is something which we've discussed quite in a bit, right? So, thank you so much for such interesting stories from everywhere. I really enjoyed listening and understanding so many things. And I came with a very different perspective of looking at GI in a way where, in a very straightforward way, or whether GI is doing its thing, whether GI is helping achieving the objective. But now I go back with a very different approach of looking at, are a lot of things happening in the community? Are these stories? Are all of these variations and differences between products, between jurisdictions, actually within GI law itself? Like,
Yeah.
there are so many other important factors like culture, like the socioeconomic um, backgrounds, the politics, which play such an important role in preservation of cultures and evolution, that it's not always, the solution is not always GI.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this super interesting conversation.
Thank you for having me.
We started off with GI registrations, and whether their GI registration is really playing a role in protection and empowerment. And then we moved into livelihoods. We looked at how money and funds play a role in it, and then the quality control aspect of it. We had some super interesting stories like Mansukhbhai's story, and the three different variations of Bandhani, and how it's also necessary to acknowledge and recognize the efforts put in by people from different regions when things like migration comes into play, when there are class and caste dynamics that come into play, and not to look at it from a very straightforward thing of I did something or my community did something, because again, GI is a community or a collective, right, or a community, right? So my community did something, so I want a certificate for it, and I'm being celebrated for that certificate. But is it really reaching those who've actually put in that effort?
Right.
Examples like Mansukhbhai say that even if GI is a community, right, when situations like that arise where he's the only one in the whole family, uh, is
Bela
that
Printing.
revival really worth it, or is that revival really necessary, or like,
Is that
where
revival even possible?
is that
That's
revival
the
even
first
possible?
question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right. So they're like really interesting insights and different ways of looking at it. Thank you so much for this. Before we end it, if somebody from the government or policymakers are watching this video, what would you like to say to them?
Uh, I think having different labels, like what Europe has done, would be much better for a country like India, which is so big, so diverse, and diverse not just in terms of culture, but in terms of state enforcement policies. And I argue about this in a chapter, in a co-authored chapter, where subnational variation plays a big role. So it cannot be a top-down approach, especially in a country like India, where you have one body deciding for every state and for every district. Because even within states, what I saw in Gujarat was that two districts were not the same in terms of their craft, in terms of their access to institutions, and in terms of their knowledge. So we are not in, I mean, one law will not work for everything. So that is one thing which we need to take care of. Secondly, people who are in power, whether you like it or not, despite the law being there, people who are in power actually decides whether that law is enforced or not. And that is also why I think Gujarat was a success story, because at least at that time, people who were in power were really interested in picking up these communities because they were working with the communities together. That's not the story in every state, unfortunately. There's also funds. So again, interestingly enough, when I was deciding where to go for my field work, I was actually going towards, and I know I'm extending, but I'll just take 2 minutes. I was going towards Uttar Pradesh because that's a region I understand better because I'm from that region. But somebody actually told me that go to Gujarat simply because there are more funds pumped in there from the central government for reasons which we are aware of. And that has enabled Gujarat to make an ecosystem which welcomes researchers to come and study their craft, which is not available in all other states, including Uttar Pradesh. So that is one reason. I mean, GI. That is again why I'm saying GI has actually come much later because it's different from other. It does not create. It only recognizes. So that journey from creation to having a reputation worthy enough of a GI tag is something which other factors work on, not GI. GI comes much later. So I think having different labels like how Europe has managed to do TSG, PDI, and PDO, PGI would I think work better in a place like India. It's also interesting because Europe has now finally enacted a law which I think will come into enforcement soon. It was December 2025, the last I checked, where they are expanding this protection to handicrafts too in Europe. So, for example, glass work, etc., etc. Now, whether we want to learn from them is a different question altogether. Because again, transplanting it, we are seeing is not necessarily working for India. But I think having those different labels and acknowledging that subnational variation could be a better way of going about GI enforcement could be a way ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. And do you have any last words that you would like to mention for artisans specifically?
For artisans, I'll be very honest. When I saw them, when I spoke with them, interacted with them, I understood their situation better. Um, for instance, how many of them will watch this video? For instance, most likely no, not many of them. Only the ones in much better off places will watch this video. And for artisans, I don't know. Don't forget your lineage. I know it's easier said than done. I know it's easy for me to sit in a room in front of a laptop and say that please protect your culture, but that's not how people there would look like. But if there is a space where you can interact with researchers like us more, please do welcome us in your homes. Because and again, in one spicy IP post, I did mention that somebody just refused to interact with me because they thought that I will just do a PhD and leave and no change will occur. But I think this is a start because if some names and stories have made up to a spicy IP podcast, which is obviously the biggest platform in India for IP law, more people will watch this and more people will probably know about Bela Printing now. If they heard the whole thing. So just maybe welcome us more, maybe researchers. We do come with decent intentions. Yes, we can't make impact initially, we can't have direct impact on your craft, but maybe we can help take these names on more reachable platforms like this. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. It was lovely having this conversation with you. And I hope this reaches out to the people um, whom we would like it to reach out. And there's lots of learning, and there is some kind of a step forward through this. Thank
Yeah.
you so much for all your efforts and for all those interesting stories which have actually come out on the platform today.
Thank you to Swaraj sir, and of course you for this platform, and to my parent institute, Queen's University Belfast, because of which I was able to do this field work, because of which I'm able to tell these stories. Yeah, and my supervisory team, Dr. Pratyushna Preti and Professor Giancarlo Frosio.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.